So how did a baseball bat even come into the conversation? When Detective Thowson and Detective James LaRochelle initially spoke to Blaise the day she was arrested, they asked her if she had any weapons in her car. Blaise paused for a moment before saying, quote, "a bat." Beyond time of death, Dr. Sims testified about Duran Bailey's injuries, including his blunt force trauma to the head, and Dr. Sims testified it was unlikely a bat was used in the murder due to the dent of Duran Bailey's injuries and also the blood splatter. A witness for the defense testified it was likely fists injured Duran Bailey as well as the forceful slamming of his head against the concrete wall of the trash enclosure. In their case, the prosecution had to explain how Blaise was able to overcome Bailey. They said after she stabbed Duran Bailey, she went to her car to get that bat.
This would be an extremely unusual case for the United States and for any probably developed country. But I've never heard it in relation to a female. I've never read about it, never been in my experience. I've never heard about it at conference.
That would be like a beating type of injury, you're saying?
Well, this was I'm talking about the sexual aspect of having his penis cut off and having his rectal area injured, having his scrotum stabbed. Those are the type of injuries that you only see in certain contexts.
Dr. Sims didn't agree with the prosecution's theory, but didn't say that when testifying.
Between that 10 and 18 hour mark, she has a pretty solid alibi. It was that 24-hour mark where we got into kind of overnight territory that no one could account for her because, if you ask her lawyers, she was sleeping, right? So that 24-hour was really what I, again, as a layperson, felt like gave the window of opportunity for the crime.
I don't disagree with you. It's baffling to me why it worked that way, because for anybody to be put in prison, I want to be very clear about this. For anybody to be put in prison based on an interval of hours during one day, based on rigor mortis, that's a real serious problem. The prosecution, they're the ones that are in charge of the strategy of the case. They're the ones that ask the questions. I'm not there to preach or to, add more than what I'm asked, but that was a bit of a bafflement to me why they picked an extension that was actually extremely low probability in order to convict somebody. It didn't make any sense.
In preparation for the first trial, a lot of evidence was examined. Blaise's car, that bat in her car, both of which were found to have no blood or DNA. Evidence from the crime scene included fingerprints, semen, pubic hair, and tire treads. And the physical evidence at the scene did point to, at the very least, someone being there besides Blaise. Blaise was excluded as the source of 4 identifiable crime scene fingerprints. A spot on the interior of Blaise's car side driver door panel and on her car seat cover tested weakly positive after a presumptive luminol test came back with the presence of an unknown iron-bearing substance. Blood, of course, contains iron, but both spots tested negative as being blood when subjected to a more precise test. Blaise's defense argued at trial that those false positives found in her car should be excluded and not presented to the jury as it was proven that they weren't blood. However, Judge Vega sided with the prosecution and let the jury hear about positive blood tests in Blaise's car.
That Metro is just too willing to be sloppy, and we've fought very hard to keep that out because there's lots of false positives, and the company that makes that test tells you there's false positives.
I want to reiterate, a false positive blood test came up in Blaise's car. Further testing confirmed it was not blood. Attorney Stephen Jackson, who knows Blaise and grew up in our hometown of Panaca, Nevada, says he comes across false positives all the time in his cases.
Let's talk about luminol for a minute. It doesn't necessarily just react on blood. It'll react on a lot of things. It'll react on vomit. It'll react on urine and feces and pretty much any human excrement. Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Anything that we eject from our bodies, it's going to react on, or it can react on. It's not necessarily going to, but it can. And so the notion that she said that you could call that a positive. So one, why are we even talking about that? It's one of the things that when you're making a relevance analysis is, will it help the jury or will it confuse them? And in that specific sense, it confuses the hell out of them.
Michelle Revelle remembers hearing about the positive test results during the testimony in the courtroom.
I question everything now. And you can't help it because you have proof right there in front of you that Thousand had absolute proof that she was elsewhere. So did Kephart and DiGiacomo. They knew, but they went ahead with it anyway. And the judge, Vega, went ahead with it anyway. And I mean, the police officers sat there on the stand and made it sound like they had evidence and talked about phenolphthalein and luminol ad nauseum until you were so confused by the whole thing that nobody even, and I'm sure those jurors had no clue that there wasn't any in her case. I mean, if you look at the testimony, especially from the first trial, that testimony was long. And they just kept bringing it up and bringing it up and bringing it up. All I know is I'm sitting there in the courtroom. I guarantee that they were just as confused as I was. And I actually come home and look at the reports and go, but wait a minute, there's nothing here. Why did we have to listen to so many questions about luminol and phenolphthalein?
And no blood found in Blaise's car, if she was the killer, is a pretty impressive feat. Dr. Sims testified that during the attack and subsequent murder, Duran Bailey lost about 40% of his blood, which would have left the murderer or murderers completely covered in the victim's blood. However, again, nothing was found in Blaise's car. Is this possible? Here's Dr. Sims talking about Duran Bailey's injuries.
This guy was involved in an altercation. He had defensive injuries, and then he lost the fight. So I mean, does that sound like, number one, does that sound like a woman? And number two is that it's very likely the person that was going after him suffered injuries. So I mean, that didn't make any sense either. This doesn't fit that a female could even do it, number one, but whoever did it had injuries themselves.
And since the prosecution maintained Blaise's attack was the same incident as Duran Bailey's murder, they pointed to the fact that Blaise told police after her attack she threw her clothes out the window of her car along with the knife that she used to fend off her attacker. Is it likely she was able to sit in the driver's seat of her car and not get blood on anything and then toss bloody clothes out the window without getting anything anywhere on her car? Probably not. The jury also heard from probation officer Laura Johnson. You may remember Laura Johnson is the friend who Dixie Tinkin called after speaking to Blaise. Dixie Tinkin was a former teacher of Blaise's, and Blaise confided in her about her attack. After Blaise tells Dixie about almost being raped and cutting a man's penis to get away, Dixie then calls probation officer Laura Johnson, who then calls Metro Police. On the stand, Johnson testifies Dixie told her that Blaise told Dixie she was hiding out. Dixie Tinkin testified that she never told Laura Johnson that. Diane Parker also took the stand during the trial. And while she maintained that Duran Bailey did in fact rape her, she said she had no involvement in his murder. Diane testified that she heard about a crime scene near her apartment from her boyfriend, Stephen King. Diane also told the jury she went to see the scene for herself to see if it might have been Duran Bailey. No one really follows up with Diane why she may have thought the victim at a random nearby crime scene would have been Duran Bailey. Phil Cohn, Blaise's attorney, says to him, it's obvious who the most likely suspects were for the murder of Duran Bailey. Diane Parker's friends who threatened him shortly before he was killed. Detective Thowson on the stand testifies that he looked into Diane's friends and says they were stand-up citizens. During trial, another theme hit home by the prosecution was it was too coincidental that there are two cases where a man's penis was stabbed or cut off, which is a fair point. However, if you look at Las Vegas in 2001, it's not the Vegas we know now. At the time, Las Vegas had one of the highest rates of rape in the country, about 30% higher than other parts of the country. This is according to FBI crime reports. That means maybe it isn't so far-fetched that Blaise was almost raped and Diane Parker was raped within a 6-week time period. Therefore, two cases where a penis could potentially have been out to be cut. Or at least that was Blaise's defense. But was Blaise attacked? We'll never know. Police never tried to determine if there was in fact two separate incidents. Detective Thowson testifies he made calls to urologists and hospitals trying to confirm Blaise's attack and found nothing. It's important to note Detective Thowson showed no evidence of making those calls in any of his reports. Attorney Stephen Jackson says he's not surprised nothing came up if, in fact, Detective Thousand made the calls that he said he did.
What if it was really superficial? I'm not going to the hospital on that. Like, I'm just not. Like, how did you get stabbed in the penis is not a question I want to have to answer.
On the stand, Detective Thousand testified he didn't really look into Blaise's attack because, quote, it didn't happen. To explain why Duran Bailey's penis would have been out, prosecutors William Kephart and Sandra DiGiacomo said Blaise likely agreed to exchange sex for drugs, but could produce no person that ever said Blaise had ever been a prostitute or done sexual favors for drugs. Also, at the time of Duran Bailey's murder, Blaise wasn't on drugs. How do we know? Blaise left Las Vegas and went to Panaca to get off drugs. The prosecution would argue she went up there to hide. Blaise's attorney Phil Cohn said it was only during the trial did the prosecution ever acknowledge Blaise was in Panaca before the murder.
They always believed that she was down here all the time. But when I proved to them, no, she was in Panaca. She saw the doctor on Friday, 2 days before the killing.
Blaise saw a doctor on July 5th in Panaca and had blood drawn. She also provided urine samples for the next 2 days. Those blood and urine samples all tested negative for the presence of meth. The prosecution argued Blaise had gone too long without meth and became desperate, driving to Las Vegas to get some. Attorney Stephen Jackson, who you may remember, grew up in Panaca and says Blaise would not have needed to drive to Las Vegas for meth. There was plenty in Panaca.
I've never used meth, but I do not know anyone who had difficulty finding drugs in that area. You wouldn't drive to Vegas to get meth. You just wouldn't.
We've mentioned a few times how multiple witnesses placed Blaise in Panaca from July 2nd through July 9th. The jury, however, was unaware of some of that alibi testimony corroborating Blaise's presence in Panaca because Judge Vega sided with the prosecution, citing inadequate notice of witnesses and did not allow those witnesses to testify. Blaise also took the stand to testify, and she talked about her own attack, which she maintained happened weeks before Duran Bailey was murdered. In her testimony, she described Boulder Highway in Las Vegas and the budget suites and denied ever knowing Duran Bailey. Prosecutor Bill Kephart maintained Blaise's facts were just jumbled because of her meth use.
Kephart asked her, too, why are you carrying the butterfly knife? And it's because I've been assaulted and it's not going to happen to me anymore.
So what evidence did the prosecution present at trial? They had nothing tying Blaise to the crime scene. In fact, they had evidence which pointed to another suspect, including pubic hair, semen, male footprints, and those footprints were in the victim's blood. They also had tire tracks that didn't match Blaise's car. They had no physical evidence to put her and Duran Bailey together. What they did have was Blaise's initial statements to police, which they said was a confession to the murder of Duran Bailey. And thanks to that lengthened time of death, they had a small window of opportunity where they say Blaise could have committed the murder. They also had probation officer Laura Johnson, who says she heard from Dixie Tinkin that Blaise was hiding out after the murder. The prosecution really only had circumstantial evidence, but they had a smoking gun, a jailhouse snitch named Corinda Martin. Corinda Martin told the jury that while in the Clark County Detention Center, Blaise would brag to anyone and everyone that she had murdered Duran Bailey. Corinda Martin testified Blaise said that she had cut Duran Bailey's penis off and shoved it down his throat. She said Blaise bragged so much that she actually began to keep a log.
That snitch saying that she bragged about it was really harmful.
Damaging? Yes. But Blaise's attorney Phil Cohn said he was prepared to show that Corinda Martin would do anything to get out of prison and said Corinda Martin hoped by being the state's witness, they would let her out early. Phil Cohn knew Corinda Martin was trying to get out early because he had uncovered letters allegedly written from her to someone on the outside. In those letters, Corinda Martin urged her friend to contact her trial judge and ask that Corinda be released early to medically care for her. Phil Cohn and Blaise's defense team said it showed that Corinda Martin would do anything to get out of jail early, including lie. Judge Vega did not allow Phil Cohn to question Corinda Martin about those letters.
They wouldn't let me cross-examine her about everything else she had done to get out of jail. Vega just shut me down.
Corinda Martin, despite saying that she logged all of the times Blaise bragged about killing Duran Bailey, produced no such log at trial. The prosecution was also unable to produce any other inmates that said Blaise talked about the murder. As the trial began to wrap up, here are the most damning things that jury heard, in my opinion. Of course, Blaise's own statements, which the prosecution said were confessions, things including, "I'm sorry, Daddy, I did it." The jury also heard about the, quote, positive blood test and Corinda Martin. So I can see how a jury might say, well, if Blaise did do it, we don't know where she was during some of the window of the time. There was blood found in her car, she confessed, and Corinda Martin, she bragged to a friend how she did it. In the last episode, I asked you to consider, is it possible there were 2 attacks where a man's penis was stabbed within 6 weeks of each other? Now I ask you to consider, is it possible for someone to commit a violent, brutal, bloody murder and leave no traces of themselves at the crime scene or in their car? Duran Bailey lost 6 teeth. Blaise didn't leave a hair. These are just some of the questions the jury will have to work through. And closing arguments begin on Friday, May 18th. Prosecutor William Kephart says Blaise told detectives she did it, and tells the jury Blaise met up with Duran Bailey when Blaise was at the end of a 3-day drug binge. Keep in mind, there are hospital records of Blaise's on July 5th and July 6th. Her stepmom Becky took off work to care for Blaise. Duran Bailey was murdered July 8th. Attorney Phil Cohn tells the jury they're talking about 2 different events. She's never met Duran Bailey and said Duran Bailey was not the man who attacked her in May. He said there's nothing, absolutely nothing, that connects my client with Duran Bailey. Friday, May 18th at 9 p.m., Judge Vega gives instructions to the jury. At 3 a.m. on May 19th, the jury came back. But before they came back, they sent a notice to the court asking for protection against Blaise's father, Lorenzo. The defense knew it was over.
With all my heart, I believe that she didn't do it. And it's just because I know this kid.
Blaise is found guilty on both counts, first-degree murder and sexual penetration of a dead body. And because of that necrophilia charge, she has to register as a sex offender. Blaise is immediately taken into custody and sentenced to a minimum of 40 years before she's eligible for parole. Here's attorney Stephen Jackson.
I don't care that she was convicted. People get convicted all the time. There are hundreds of cases that have been overturned because people have been convicted and the evidence was bad. It doesn't bother me that she was convicted by a jury.
While the jury comes back with the verdict, it's up to Judge Vega on the sentencing. Blaise is looking at 40 to 100 years for the murder charge and another 5 years for that necrophilia charge. Judge Vega made the decision to run Blaise's sentences consecutively, meaning she had to finish one sentence, then begin time on the other. Judge Vega could have had them run concurrently, meaning she's serving time for both at the same time.
Nobody expected her to run that consecutive.
Blaise is sent to the Florence McClure Female Prison in Las Vegas to begin her sentence. She's 19 years old.
The point to leave with people is look at the evidence objectively. There isn't enough evidence to convict her, in that beyond a reasonable doubt standard.
2 years after her conviction, Blaise is a free woman. How? That's next on Presumption of Guilt.